Today we're going to explore the different types of real estate leases. Understanding these lease types is crucial because they define the relationship between landlords and tenants and set the terms for how the property is used and paid for. Each lease type comes with its own set of responsibilities and financial arrangements, so knowing these distinctions helps both parties make informed decisions. We'll break down the key categories and what makes each one unique. A real estate lease is essentially a legal contract that allows a tenant to use a property for a specific period, as long as they pay rent. It's important to understand that leasing only grants possession and the right to use the property. It does not transfer ownership. Ownership, on the other hand, means long-term control, equity, and value in the property. So while a lease gives you temporary rights, it's the owner who holds the true control and financial benefits over time. This distinction is fundamental when we talk about real estate leases and ownership. Now let's talk about the different types of real estate leases and why leasing is so important for businesses. One major advantage of leasing is flexibility. Leasing allows companies to adapt more quickly to changing conditions compared to owning property, which can be much harder to adjust or relocate from. Another key point is cost control. The way a lease is structured directly impacts how predictable your costs are, the level of risk you take on, and your overall operating expenses. Finally, leasing plays a crucial role in business growth. Having the right lease in place can support your company's scaling efforts, help with expansion plans, and align with your broader location strategy. These three concepts, flexibility, cost control, and growth, are essential reasons why leasing matters so much. Now let's talk about the four main types of leases you'll encounter in real estate. First, there's the grace lease, where the tenant pays a fixed rent, and the landlord covers most of the property expenses like taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Next is the net lease, where the tenant pays rent plus some or all property expenses, which can vary depending on the agreement. Then we have the triple net lease, often called NNN, where the tenant is responsible for rent plus all property-related expenses, taxes, insurance, and maintenance, giving them more control but also more financial responsibility. Lastly, there's the percentage lease, commonly used in retail, where the tenant pays a base rent plus a percentage of their sales. Understanding these lease types is crucial because they affect the financial obligations and risks for both landlords and tenants. Now, let's talk about gross leases and what makes them unique. In a gross lease, the tenant pays a single fixed rent amount. What's important here is that this rent typically covers everything, meaning the landlord takes care of most property operating expenses. These expenses usually include property taxes, building insurance, and maintenance for common areas or any upkeep needed. So from the tenant's perspective, it's a simpler arrangement because they don't have to worry about fluctuating costs throughout the lease term. This makes gross leases a popular choice for many businesses seeking predictable monthly costs. Understanding this is key as we explore the different types of real estate leases. Now, let's talk about the gross lease and who is responsible for what costs in this type of agreement. In a gross lease, the tenant pays only the base rent. This means that the rent you see up front typically includes more than just the space itself. The landlord, on the other hand, takes care of a number of additional expenses. These include property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and even utilities. Essentially, the landlord bundles all these operating costs into the rent, which can make budgeting easier for the tenant since they don't have to manage or pay these expenses separately. Understanding this split is crucial because it affects how you plan your finances as a tenant or a landlord. So remember, with a gross lease, tenants focus on paying their fixed rent, while landlords handle the variable costs associated with the property. Now let's look at who benefits most from a gross lease. First, for tenants, this type of lease offers predictable monthly occupancy costs, which means fewer surprise expenses for operating costs. It makes budgeting much simpler and more reliable. For landlords, gross leases are ideal for owners who prefer simplified billing and a more hands-off approach to managing their tenants. This arrangement reduces administrative hassle since the landlord typically covers many of the operating expenses directly. Gross leases work best in certain situations, small office spaces, first-time tenants who might appreciate the predictability, and scenarios where stable budgeting is a priority. Overall, gross leases offer a straightforward and low-stress leasing option for both parties when predictability and simplicity are key. Now let's focus on net leases, which are really the foundation of many commercial real estate agreements. Essentially, a net lease shifts the responsibility for certain property costs from the landlord to the tenant. When we say net in this context, it means the tenant doesn't just pay a base rent. They also take on one or more operating expenses, like property taxes, insurance, or maintenance. So instead of the landlord covering these costs, the tenant adds these expenses on top of the base rent. This structure helps clarify who is responsible for what, and is a key concept in understanding different types of real estate leases. Here we have a breakdown of a net lease, specifically focusing on costs. In a basic net lease, the tenant is responsible for paying the base rent, just like in standard leases. However, what sets it apart is that the tenant also takes on the property tax expenses associated with the property. This is important because it shifts some financial responsibility from the landlord to the tenant. It's worth noting that other operating costs, like maintenance or insurance, might still be the landlord's responsibility unless the lease explicitly requires the tenant to cover those as well. Understanding these distinctions helps clarify the financial obligations in different types of real estate leases. Here we're focusing on the triple net lease, often abbreviated as NNN lease, which represents the maximum level of responsibility for the tenant. In this type of lease, the tenant is responsible not just for the base rent, but also for three key expenses: property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs. The three N's stand for these three components. So, when you see NNN lease, remember that the tenant handles taxes, insurance, and maintenance, making it quite comprehensive compared to other types of real estate leases. This setup is commonly used in commercial real estate, where landlords want to pass on many ongoing expenses to the tenant. Understanding this is crucial because it directly affects the financial obligations and risks for the tenant. Under a triple net lease, often called an NNN lease, the tenant takes on more financial responsibility beyond just the base rent. This means the tenant is not only paying rent, but also covering additional expenses such as property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and common area maintenance fees, or CAM charges. It's important to understand that the base rent is really just the starting point in terms of cost. The total monthly outlay for the tenant can increase significantly because many of the operating expenses for the property are passed through directly to them. One critical thing to keep in mind is that even if the base rent stays fixed, these additional costs can rise over time, which can impact the tenant's overall budget. So, when budgeting, tenants need to closely review these pass-through charges to avoid surprises. This kind of lease structure is especially common in single-tenant buildings and retail pads. It shifts much of the financial risk and responsibility to the tenant, making it crucial to understand all potential costs before entering into an NNN lease agreement. Now, let's talk about the percentage lease, which is especially common in the retail sector. In this type of lease, the tenant pays a base rent, which is a fixed amount, plus a percentage of their store sales. This means that the total rent can vary depending on how well the business performs. Typically, there's a minimum rent guaranteed by the tenant, and once their sales exceed a certain agreed-upon threshold, or breakpoint, they start sharing a portion of those additional sales with the landlord. This structure helps align the interests of both the tenant and the landlord, since the rent reflects the store's success. It's an important concept to understand when examining different types of real estate leases. Here we're looking at how a percentage lease works, which is a common type of lease in commercial real estate. Essentially, the tenant pays a fixed base rent each month. This is a set amount agreed upon in the lease. On top of that, they pay an additional percentage of their sales, but only once those sales surpass a certain threshold known as the breakpoint. For example, imagine a tenant pays $2,000 per month as base rent. If their gross sales exceed $100,000 in a given period, they then pay an additional 5% on the amount above that $100,000 mark. This structure benefits both landlords and tenants because it aligns rent payments with the tenant's business performance, providing flexibility and potential upside for both parties. This kind of lease is particularly useful in retail spaces, where sales can fluctuate and landlords want to share in the tenant's success. Understanding these key components, base rent, sales percentage, and breakpoint, is crucial when navigating real estate lease options. Now, let's talk about percentage leases and when they are typically used. Percentage leases are most common in retail stores, restaurants, and gyms or fitness clubs. These are businesses where the sales volume is a strong indicator of how valuable the location is. One of the key advantages of percentage leases is that they allow for shared risk between the landlord and the tenant. This means the landlord has a direct interest in the tenant's success because their income partially depends on the tenant's sales performance. This arrangement aligns the incentives of both parties and can be beneficial in high-traffic, sales-driven environments. Essentially, it's a partnership where both landlord and tenant benefit when sales go up. Here, we're looking at how tenant financial risk varies across different types of real estate leases. As landlord costs are passed on to the tenant's financial exposure increases. In a gross lease, the landlord typically covers most expenses, so the tenant's risk is comparatively low. Moving to a net lease, the tenant begins to take on some costs, pushing their financial risk to a medium level. Finally, in a triple net or NNN lease, the tenant assumes the majority of expenses, which means their financial risk is the highest. Understanding this spectrum is crucial for evaluating lease agreements and managing potential financial exposure effectively. Here we have a comparison of different lease types based on landlord involvement and management responsibilities. Starting with the gross lease, the landlord plays a highly active role here, handling most property costs as well as the day-to-day operations. This means the landlord takes on the bulk of the management and expenses, making the ownership more hands-on. Next is the percentage lease, which represents a shared focus. In this arrangement, the landlord stays involved because the rent is tied to the tenant's sales performance. It encourages a partnership dynamic where both parties benefit from the tenant's success. Lastly, the NNN lease or triple net lease shifts most responsibilities to the tenant. Here, the tenant pays for property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, resulting in minimal landlord involvement. This creates a more passive ownership structure for the landlord, with reduced management duties. Understanding these types helps in deciding the level of involvement a landlord prefers and the financial responsibilities they are willing to assume. When considering lease types, it's important to match the lease to your business needs and risk tolerance. For those who are risk-averse, a gross lease is often the best fit. This lease offers the most stability by providing predictable monthly occupancy costs, which means fewer surprise expenses. It's especially ideal for smaller teams or new tenants who want to maintain steady budgets without unexpected costs. On the other hand, established businesses may prefer a net lease. This lease type is suited for firms that can absorb variable operating expenses and have mature budgeting controls. While the base rent is lower, tenants take on more cost variability, giving them balanced cost control that can work well for companies with stable, predictable revenues. Finally, retail operators often opt for a percentage lease. This arrangement ties rent partly to sales performance, commonly seen in malls or high-traffic retail centers. It aligns rent costs with revenue, working well when foot traffic directly drives sales, making rent payments consistent with business success. Understanding these three lease types, gross lease for stability, net lease for balanced control, and percentage lease for revenue linkage, helps in choosing the lease that best fits your business model and goals. Now let's look at some common types of lease modifications and variations you'll encounter in real estate. First, the modified gross lease. In this arrangement, the tenant pays the base rent plus selected operating expenses. This gives some flexibility on which costs the tenant is responsible for. Then, we have the semi-gross lease. Here, costs are shared, but the landlord typically covers the majority of services, which can reduce tenant responsibility for maintenance or utilities. Next is the industrial net lease, where the tenant takes on additional costs like taxes, insurance, and maintenance, making it a more hands-on lease type for tenants. Finally, the master lease involves one tenant who controls the entire property and has the right to sublease it to others. This type is useful for larger property management or investment strategies. Understanding these variations is key to choosing the right lease for your needs. Now let's talk about the modified gross lease, which is a common type of real estate lease. In this arrangement, operating costs are shared between the landlord and the tenant, rather than one party being responsible for all expenses. Typically, the base rent is fixed, providing some stability in the tenant's payments. However, certain costs like taxes, insurance, or common area maintenance fees, often called CAM charges, may be divided between both parties. The specific way these costs are split isn't set in stone. It's negotiated on a case-by-case basis to fit the needs of both landlord and tenant. This flexibility is really the key feature of a modified gross lease. Let's go over some of the key negotiation points that are critical when dealing with real estate leases. First, the lease term itself is fundamental. It defines how long the tenant will occupy the space, which affects both flexibility and financial commitments. Next, renewal options are important because they give tenants the opportunity to extend the lease under pre-agreed terms, providing stability and predictability. CAM caps, or common area maintenance caps, help control the amount tenants have to pay toward shared expenses, which can prevent unexpected cost increases. Escalation clauses, on the other hand, outline how rent may increase over time, often tied to inflation or operating costs, ensuring the landlord can keep up with rising expenses, but also keeping tenants aware of potential hikes. Exclusivity clauses protect tenants by preventing landlords from leasing nearby spaces to direct competitors, which can be crucial for certain businesses. Finally, termination provisions define conditions under which either party can exit the lease early, offering an important safety net if circumstances change. Understanding these negotiation points helps ensure both landlord and tenant can reach a fair, clear agreement that minimizes disputes and supports a successful leasing relationship. Here, we're breaking down some common lease terms that are important to understand in any real estate agreement. First up is CAM, or Common Area Maintenance. This refers to the costs associated with shared spaces like lobbies, parking lots, landscaping, and hallways. Basically, the upkeep everyone benefits from. Next is the escalation clause. This is a provision that allows the rent to increase over time, often tied to a predetermined schedule, inflation, or rising operating expenses. It helps landlords keep up with changing costs. Then there's the renewal option, which gives the tenant the right to extend their lease after the initial term ends, usually under agreed-upon conditions. Lastly, tenant improvement allowance is the money the landlord provides to help customize or build out the rented space to better suit the tenant's needs. Understanding these terms can really clarify lease agreements and what each party is responsible for. When reviewing lease agreements, it's crucial to watch out for several red flags that could lead to costly surprises. First, uncapped CAM charges. These are common area maintenance fees that, if not capped, can escalate unexpectedly, increasing your expenses without limit. Next, inflexible renewal terms can lock you into unfavorable conditions or prevent you from adapting as your needs change. It's important to negotiate terms that offer some flexibility. Another key point is unclear maintenance boundaries. You want to be certain about what repairs and upkeep responsibilities fall on you versus the landlord. Lastly, excessive termination penalties can be a major burden if you need to end your lease early, so watch out for those hefty fees. Keeping an eye on these issues before signing can save you time, money, and stress down the line. When approaching the lease review process, it's crucial to follow a clear step-by-step method. First, understand the type of lease you're dealing with, because each has different implications. Next, carefully review the financial obligations to know exactly what you're committing to in terms of rent and additional costs. Then, check for hidden costs that might not be obvious at first glance, but can impact your budget later. After that, focus on negotiating terms to ensure they're fair and align with your interests. Finally, conduct a thorough legal review to protect yourself from any potential pitfalls. Remember, The key is to prioritize the structure of the lease before worrying about the money, and assess risks fully before signing. Always review the lease in this order to avoid missing important details and ensure a solid, informed agreement. Here, we have a real-world example involving a clothing retailer in a busy mall. This retailer is considering a percentage lease, which means their rent is partly based on a percentage of their sales. The main advantage is that the high foot traffic in the mall can lead to increased revenue, which is great for business. However, the risk is that during slower seasons, the rent payments still rise as sales fluctuate, which can squeeze profit margins. This example helps illustrate the types of real estate leases and how they impact both opportunities and challenges for businesses in retail spaces. Now, let's talk about a real-world scenario involving office space leases, particularly relevant for startups. When a startup leases office space, they often have to choose between two main types of leases: the gross lease and the triple net lease. A gross lease offers one predictable payment each month, which is great for budgeting, especially when cash flow is tight. This means the rent you pay covers most expenses, and you don't have to worry about additional costs popping up unexpectedly. On the other hand, a triple net lease usually has a lower base rent, but you'll be responsible for taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance costs. These add variable expenses on top of your rent, which can make monthly payments less predictable. For most early-stage companies, gross leases are typically better because they reduce surprise expenses and administrative burden. This predictability helps startups focus their energy and resources on growth, rather than constantly managing fluctuating costs. So understanding these lease types is crucial when planning your office space and managing your finances effectively. To wrap up, there are several key takeaways to keep in mind when dealing with real estate leases. First, it's crucial that the lease type aligns with your risk tolerance. Different lease structures carry different levels of risk, so understanding what you're comfortable with is essential. Next, the financial impact can vary widely depending on the lease terms, so don't assume all leases are created equal. Negotiation plays a big role as well. Sometimes a few adjustments can significantly change the overall economics in your favor. Don't overlook hidden costs, which can be just as significant as the base rent itself. Finally, it's always a smart move to have a professional review the lease before you sign. In short, choose with your eyes wide open, fully informed about the types of real estate leases available and the implications of each. To wrap up, let's summarize the main types of real estate leases we've discussed. Each lease type has its own unique features and responsibilities, from who pays for maintenance and taxes to how the rent is structured. Understanding these differences is crucial whether you're a landlord or a tenant. Knowing which lease fits your situation best can help avoid misunderstandings and ensure that both parties are clear on their obligations and benefits. This summary captures the key points and sets a solid foundation for making informed leasing decisions.